pleasure to be here on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And what I wanted to really speak about was my experiences as a cultural diplomat and on the value of person-to-person cultural diplomacy. There's a lot we can do with technology. It certainly can facilitate discussions. It certainly can help bring people together. But we also know we've all had those probably text discussions with a loved one that maybe we're not loving at the moment so much, or a good friend, right? There's no human facial contact when you send a text message, right? Sarcasm doesn't come through properly, jokes don't come through properly, criticism may come through more harshly than you mean it. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation with technology, and a lot of room for, I think, conflict. And so I think that technology can help us. And in a world where we seemingly are staring at our cell phones, it's important to remember the need to really engage on the ground. And I think that we can do a lot of counter-radicalization work, for example. Colette's worked on that. We can facilitate global discussions, but nothing can replace the people-to-people contact. Nothing can replace the value of that. So what exactly is cultural diplomacy? I think the very idea of it, although seemingly new, isn't, right? Diplomats over 1,000 years ago, when they first went, right, as an envoy to a country, they would bring with them gifts from that country, right? And they would bestow them to the ruler and sort of as a token of their civilization. They're usually arts, right? Pottery, jewelry, gold, whatever. And we do something similar today, right? When we travel abroad, if we stay with friends, we bring something from home. I'm from New England, so I tend to bring maple syrup, right, from Connecticut. Or I tend to bring, if I'm traveling with friends that I've made maybe some clam chowder, frozen in a pot for them, right? So you bring something, that's in essence, sort of a heart of cultural diplomacy. But on a more institutionalized level, as an educator, I have a fundamental belief in educational partnerships and educational exchanges. And my personal record is an example of this. I got into the field of international relations about 20 years ago now, when I had the opportunity to go to Crimea as a senior in high school with about a dozen other Americans from my high school, thanks to a teacher called Bob Brown, who was my AP history teacher. And he took us to Crimea, and we stayed at a youth camp called Artek. And Artek used to be a big communist youth camp. And we were there and met all kinds of students from around the world and lived with these Ukrainian/Russian families. I'm very intimate with the entire Ukraine-Russia-Crimea situation because of my time there. And indeed, when I speak about that today in terms of policy, my time there as a very young person certainly gives me a lot of information upon which to draw. But it got me wondering, because the families I lived with were so wonderful, and the parents of the students who were my colleagues, their parents were hiding under desks in the 1950s and 60s like my parents were. They were worried that the Americans were going to drop a bomb on them. And my parents were hiding under desks in the 1950s or 60s, worried that the Soviets were going to drop a bomb on them, right? And so I wanted to understand how this was, that these seemingly families that were very similar, right? I come from an Italian-American family, so we tend to go for more our spaghetti bolognese. They tend to go for the vereni and panini. But food differences aside, they were very similar, right? They wanted a better life for their children. They were working hard. And so I became interested in the causes of war and the conditions of peace, which is the basis of the study of international relations, started about 1919 after the First World War. So that very first experience, right, where I was in an exchange and I was a cultural diplomat as a young American, meeting all of these individuals, many of whom are close friends. I have I call her my Russian sister Tanya, who now lives in America. We're like family to this day. And most recently, I just had someone reach out to me, Yulia, who I hadn't seen in almost 20 years, and she found me on Facebook, right? So there's an interesting way how social media has connected, across decades, individuals who met in person many years ago. And I think social media has the greatest role to play in facilitating connections that start on a personal level. Now, as you know, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy and the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy, who are hosting this great series of talks, is located in Berlin. And although I lived in Crimea and then later also lived in Russia, I've been no better treated by any country other than Germany. I went my junior abroad on a scholarship from the Federation of German American Women's Clubs. Right? So where did those German American Women's Clubs start? Well, that in itself is cultural diplomacy. And the German-American relationship benefited extraordinarily through this relationship in the 20th century. After the war, there were obviously occupying forces. And into the 50s and 60s, a number of the American wives on the base reached out to the German wives in the community and founded these clubs, these social clubs. And they started doing the social things that women did at that time. But later, they also decided we should do more, right? We should work to broaden reconciliation and understanding between Germans and Americans. And many of them on both sides had come from some semblance of money, and so they started the Scholarship Foundation, which continues to do so, 30 some odd Americans, and sends them to Germany for a year of study, and 30 some odd Germans and sends them to America. So I was at the University of Delaware as an undergraduate, and I went for my junior year to the University of Hamburg, and spent that entire year there as a German student, not really, as a foreign student, I was dropped right in. And it was a transformational year for me. And so there you have two levels of it. On the one hand, I was a young cultural diplomat, but I benefited from cultural diplomacy in the 50s and 60s between these women on these bases, right? And that in itself, as a side note, was a really powerful relationship. I think Germany and the United States have lost something as we've drawn down our forces. First, the drawdown means that there are less Americans in Germany. And the way that we base our forces now, increasingly sort of isolated from the community, has a negative effect. Because when you talk to a lot of my parents' generation who may have been stationed in Germany, they actually have an overwhelmingly positive impression of Germany, right? They talk about the food and the cars and the beer and their friends. And one time I was in Bad Tolz with my mother and my sister at the time, and we were in a shop, and they don't speak German, and so we were speaking English, and the gentleman said to me, "Oh, are you American?" I said, "Yes." He's like, "Oh, my sister's married to an American. She lives in Kentucky." And he went on and on about how she had married an American paratrooper who'd been stationed in Bad Tolz, right, in the 70s, and went to Kentucky and had this big whole family. And it created a series of bonds, right? And so that in itself was day-to-day cultural diplomacy. But those bonds have disintegrated. I don't think it's coincidental that there's increasing amounts of distrust and lack of understanding sometimes between German and American communities. Next, I ended up going to Germany for my master's degree. I had a scholarship. I went to the Humboldt and Freiberg-Universität in Berlin, and I did a master's in contemporary European history that was funded by a grant from the German government. And then I went on later to do a Robert Bosch fellowship. And I worked in the German Ministry of Defense for the Deputy Defense Minister, Christian Schmidt, as a special advisor. And then I finally had a DAAD fellowship, a German Academic Exchange Fellowship, to be in Potsdam. And what all of a sudden, when I went for my Bosch interview, they said, "Well, you've already been to Germany, so why should we give you another grant?" And my argument was, I had been a young person, I had been a student, now I was a professional, right? I'd been going in a working capacity. And I think it shows not just the value of initial exchanges, but of a lifelong sort of nurturing of the relationship. I don't mean to self-promote, but I'm probably a bigger promoter of Germany than most Germans are. I happen to have an awful fondness for the country. I've lived there for 4 years, and it's been central to my career. It's really helped make me who I am. And it's helped grow that. And the fundamental aspects of it were living in the society, of being taken out of what you know, what's familiar, and put into a different society, and making friends with Germans, living amongst them, becoming a part of that society. I don't think that in a digital age that social media can replace it. I think it can supplement it, but it's never going to supplant it. It can't overcome that. And conversely, I would say that it's important for all countries when they're thinking about how to engage the rest of the world to consider the ability and the feasibility of these sorts of programs, right? I think the Germans have one of the best ones, and my engagement certainly has been so. The United States has traditionally a pretty long, distinguished history with Fulbrights, but that's something that's increasingly under attack in the United States. And when I say to people about Fulbrights, they'll point out people who maybe have done Fulbrights and not necessarily been so predisposed. And like, the point isn't so that you love America, it's that you understand it, right? And it's the same thing. You might not love Germany if you spend a year there on a cultural fellowship, but you'll understand it. And that's fundamentally important when it comes to things like discussions about climate change, when it comes to discussions of war and peace, when it comes to discussions of trade. Because you do not have to necessarily agree with the position of the person sitting across from you, but you have to appreciate that position. right? You have to accept that for them, it's important, right? And if you can understand the context in which they come from, the history, the culture, the place, you will understand why for a German trade minister or a German defense minister, issue X is so important, right? And you won't necessarily be sort of hypocritical and expect a German politician or a French politician or a Ghanaian politician or an Indonesian politician to do something you yourself wouldn't do, right? And so I think in that sense, the value of cultural diplomacy remains in the person-to-person contact and remains in the sort of on-the-ground engagement. We're doing interviews right now for Fulbright scholarships at NYU. And I have the honor of being on the committee for the second year, and I love it because for me, again, and my sister as well, who studied in Italy and at Oxford, our parents were very supportive of this, probably because my mother and my father didn't have those opportunities themselves. But it was transformational for both of us. So I get giddy with excitement, right, when I get to interview these students and look for those. And we have these discussions about who would be a good envoy for America, right? Who will be able to bring with them an American experience, but also at the same time be able to adapt, be able to integrate, right? And be able to sort of go with the flow, which is important. And one of the fundamental things about Fulbright now is that they're pushing towards a societal exchange and cultural exchange. Not just I go to the library, I do my project, I maybe buy a doner kebab on the corner, talk about cultural exchange, right? But actually engaging with the society, right? Maybe if you're there to do music research and musician, engaging with a youth orchestra or a high school music ensemble. Or if you're there in an arts capacity, maybe working with a local arts museum to do outreach, right? So becoming a cultural ambassador. And so for me, this is something that we try to do at NYU, and the program that Colette teaches in and that I have the privilege of directing is organized fundamentally on the assumption that our students will increasingly be studying overseas, which is rare for a master's. And I think, again, it gives them the toolkit to become, whether it's good full-time diplomats or professionals in other capacities or non-governmental civil society operatives, right? That understanding of the other, even if it's just one society. I can't say I know every society as well as I know Germany, but my awareness of being different, right, from one society helps me to understand more easily where someone else is coming from, because I know what I don't know, right? And I'm fundamentally aware of like being uncomfortable in a different society until you become very comfortable. Today, sometimes I have a hard time remembering a word in English, but it'll come to me in German. It's sort of funny, right? Rechtsstaat, we had that the other day, Rechtsstaat. I couldn't remember rule of law, but I could remember it in German. And I think that's quite unique. So with that, I'm going to stop and open up the questions and a discussion, I hope, about the value of cultural diplomacy in a digital age when so much seems to be on the Googles and the Facebooks and on our phones, and not necessarily on the people-to-people exchanges. So thank you. So Mark.
So these questions and discussions, the benefit of this setting is it's fairly interactive. We're on the
I was told to keep it kind of.
Exactly.
Welcome to, I have a range of experience both from the NYU perspective, but internationally, and administering and running it. So if you want to start off with anything and everything, yes, please.
Sandy Haversack.
Where are you from?
Well, I'm from New York, as you can tell by my accent.
Yeah, I love it.
But originally from Australia, but I've been a cultural diplomat for my country and for the UN and in academia. So it's a testing question at the moment. If you, what is your position and what are you thinking about the diminution of the thing called the State Department represented overseas by the present government, most especially in Russia, but it is an acute at the moment.
So the United States, interesting that you asked that. My research expertise functionally is international security, and in particular civil military relations. And I'm interested in how senior civilians and senior military officials come to decisions in terms of security and diplomatic policy. The United States has increasingly, in my opinion, become a very militarized society. Whether that's in our foreign policy, which I think is quite evident, but also domestically, right? I mean, we have a problem, as a footnote here, we have the situation where our police think that they're in combat with the society they protect. The other society I happen to know very well is Britain. I spent 10 and a half years in Britain. So living in a country of 60 million people where less than 98% of the police officers do not carry a firearm, right? For Americans, this is unheard of, right? But the cops don't carry guns there, right? It's called consensual community policing. And it's a very different approach, right? And the US, there's actually, I think it might, is it called Professor War? There's a piece in the New Republic, I think, about this ex-military officer who gives these talks to the US police about being warriors and this warrior mentality. And that's completely the opposite, right? It's why officially soldiers don't really make good peacekeepers, because soldiers are trained to use maximum force, right? And police are supposed to be trained to use minimum force, right? So when you're in a peacekeeping environment and you're in a place like Basra, you don't want to shoot first and ask questions later. And this is why there's issues when it comes to peacekeeping about the suitability of soldiers. And then domestically in the US, the way we think about, I think, policing is a symptom of this larger militarization. So to go back to the State Department, this administration, I think, is in some ways a logical continuation of where we've been going. The Obama administration certainly didn't try to gut the State Department. And one would, on the surface, it seems perhaps less militaristic. But I often challenge a lot of my friends on the center left to explain why they were so incensed, and not that there's not reason, but they were so incensed by the opening of Guantanamo Bay and the indefinite detention, right, of individuals at Guantanamo Bay. And that was problematic, although there was a legal black hole to start with, right? So you needed to, maybe there was a reason to create it, but it should have been solved through a series of conventions, sort of new Hague conferences to figure out how do you deal with those individuals. But they were kept alive. The Obama administration, while not having full-scale military sort of invasion policies, nonetheless made extensive use of semi-autonomous, right, unmanned aerial systems and weapon systems to essentially target and eliminate individuals that they didn't particularly like. And they didn't really do so under the rule of law, strictly interpreted. I would say not even strictly interpreted. Right? There was no habeas corpus and due process, right? The idea that who's choosing it. It was a very small group of people in the White House. And I think if you're a good American of any political party, you should be skeptical of concentrations of power, right? And I'm like, that's due process isn't the president and the attorney general and 4 or 5 other people deciding who should be executed and who shouldn't be, right? Including people who have US passports. Now, I happen to be a universalist in the sense that I think if human rights are universal, whether you have a blue-covered US passport or not, you should be treated equally, right? So that might make me exceptional. But the Obama administration did target individuals and kill individuals who were US passport holders, not just non-US passport holders. So I think there's multiple problems there. So that might not be as bad as a full ground invasion of Iraq, but I would nonetheless argue that it's a policy that veers towards militaristic approaches rather than diplomatic ones. The State Department has been, at least for 30 years, if not longer, sort of the redheaded stepchild, no offense, of the US government. It's an oft-quoted and accurate fact that there are more military musicians in the Department of Defense than there are foreign service officers. And that is true. We have more military musicians in the United States, armed services, than we do foreign service officers. Anyone can tell you the number of foreign service officers at any diplomatic mission, I'm sure Australia is the same, is not as big as you think, right? I had the privilege to work in our mission in London for a while, and the number of foreign service officers may only be 100 out of 700 people there. And you have military attaches, and you have local hires, and there's a range of people that make up the embassy. But there's certainly a case to be made that our foreign service has been suffering, and is going to suffer further. And that the overall resources of the State Department and its sort of subsidiary organization, whether it should be subsidiary is another question, USAID, are neglected. And what we see now is not simply benign neglect, but really purposeful attempts to strangle the baby in the cradle, as it were, right? So by not filling positions, if you notice, everyone is acting, right? Well, people who are acting keep the trains running on time, but they really don't have the authority to make decisions, right? If they're at meetings, you know that this person does not necessarily serve at the pleasure of the president, right? That they do not necessarily have the ability to make the tough decisions that need to be done. Even if there were full-time people, which I wish there were, it's not quite clear in this administration how much respect they would get from the White House. But I think that the overall trend to basically shrink the State Department is dangerous. Our military, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan working with NATO on civil military projects, right? Looking at how civilians, NGOs, and diplomats in the military tried to affect operational change. It was very disconcerting. Not in the least because the military had the overwhelming amount of money, They have a great can-do attitude. I mean, I have nothing against them. They can do great stuff, but they don't have the knowledge. And they would often say that, right? They might drill a well as part of a quick impact project to help the public like them more. But they don't necessarily have the knowledge and spend the time to do the studies to understand the water table, right? They can be great at putting up a refugee camp or housing, but it's actually super important when you put a refugee camp because they often end up being rather permanent institutions, right? So there's lots of stuff that requires more knowledge, and that's something that the US, I think, has been neglecting, and in this administration is actually downsizing. And that makes it difficult because then the person that you go to interact with is going to be the defense attaché, right? And in Afghanistan, they often, when they needed development aid, they went to the military, not to the USAID rep, not to the State Department Foreign Service officer. And it's interesting because the military in the US has been the most proactive in pushing the Congress to try and fund the State Department more. General Mattis, when he was a general, still an active military officer, he said, you know, if you don't give the State Department more money, I need more money for bullets. And I'd rather have you give them more money. But the Congress and the American public at large has a very skewed interpretation of what the State Department does and what the military does. And I would say it comes from this wider sort of systematic militarization of the society. That's something that was warned about back in the 1950s by Eisenhower. And has just continued. And this was the concern of a lot of early Cold War strategists, that the permanent war footing of the Cold War would cause the United States to become an overly militarized society. I tell my students this, that the U.S. did not have, prior to the end of the Second World War, a large standing army. After every conflict, the Congress slashed the budget of the War Department, I think at that point, slashed military spending, and shrunk the army. Any idea why that was? Stems back to British political thought and British political theory. A large standing army is a threat to the government. It can coup, right? And so you don't want to have a large standing army. And so you shrink the army all the time, only when you need it. And even after the Civil War, we shrunk the Union military drastically, right? So what happened is that permanent war footing of the Cold War creates this permanent military mobilization that has gotten us where we are. And people like Kennan and Eisenhower warned about that. And it's very detrimental to the U.S. mission. And I think we see a great ebbing of U.S. influence because of that.
If I might just add something that speaks directly to your question. Years ago, I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I worked at the Murrow Center for Public Diplomacy. And the director at that time was Houston Ryan. He was the former director of the United States Information Agency. Now, the mistake that was made in the Congress, I believe many of us in the diplomatic world believe, was merging the cultures of the State Department and the United States Information Agency. The United States Information Agency used to send citizens like myself to different countries to speak. And we were free in what we spoke about, but the idea was much like that of the Rotary Ambassadorial Fellowships, which I also had to France. You were a cultural ambassador of your country to other countries. And you were free in what you said, and you had the ability to really engage with those from the local areas. I think there is talk of actually trying to resurrect the idea of the United States Information Agency because it served a vital cultural diplomacy role, one which the culture of the State Department really doesn't necessarily allow. So I think the fundamental mistake was a congressional deal that was cut with Strom Thurmond years ago to merge those two. And that's the problem that in part we see today.
It's like setting up a Goethe Institute or British Council or one of those.
There used to be, in Berlin, there used to be a building called America House, right?
Right,
And it was
exactly.
a library.
Exactly.
It's still there, I know. But it's those sorts of things are gone. And the problem is that the embassies often had cultural components of them and libraries and used to do events there. But now getting into a U.S. embassy is like trying to get into a fortress.
Yeah.
And they're not, for practical reasons, but also I think on a level that's far too extreme, right? We used to call the embassy in London, the one that's being replaced, is all glass windows, designed by Aaron O'Sarin in the 50s. It's fabulous. But in the event of a blast just on the park, on Grosvenor Square, the concussion would shatter all the glass and would be detrimental to the health of the individuals in the building. So there's realistic concerns. But at the same time, when your embassy is a fortress, how are you supposed to engage, right? How are you supposed to get people in to experience American culture and to be approachable? And I think that's a big problem. But that's an area where cultural diplomats and the exchange programs, I still to this day take great joy. And this was years ago. I mean, one of my proudest moments was when Germans started asking me if I was Norwegian or Dutch, because my American accent was was disappearing in German. I was so excited the first time I said, "Are you Dutch?" I was like, "Yes!" At one time I was in a sauna with friends in Bad Tolz, so we were chatting, and this one woman had been going on a tirade about the Bush administration, not necessarily inappropriately. And then Thomas, my friend, said, "Oh, ask Mike, he's an American." And she was like, "No, he's not." She was like, "No, no, no." And I was like, "Yeah, he is." And I always enjoy when people say, "You're really not American. You're not overweight enough," or "You speak too many languages," or this or that or this. And I was like, there's 350 million Americans in 50 different states, right? And there's a lot of plurality, and I think that's an important component to understanding. Also, most Americans don't realize the British Prime Minister, for example, is not directly elected. But most Brits also really don't appreciate the fundamental complexities of what is a highly federal system, and why that results in some of the things that happen in our government policy. Do you have a follow-up question?
Just that, to echo what you said at the beginning about the gift giving, and one of the roles of the cultural diplomat is to redefine what is the cultural stereotype of that country. So you actually bring an up-to-date value of that country rather than the large American or the Australian with the akubra and the kangaroo. Koala or whatever each country is.
You have a koala in your bag?
I am a koala. Anyway.
But it's very true. It's interesting. But it was fun. It was a great discussion just speaking about wider issues of soft power. I was listening to, the name escapes me, it's really annoying, but it was Fresh Air with Terry Gross, which is a program on WBR, and it was with an Australian who's a negotiator who's settled several hot conflicts. He was involved with actually a lot of the kidnappings that happened in Africa recently, but he's worked in the Balkans, he's worked extensively in Africa. And at one point he was taken at gunpoint, and they were threatening to kill the guy, and they were like, "You're an American." And they're like, "No, I'm not." He's like, "You're a Brit." And he's like, "No, no, no." He's like, "I'm an Aussie." Like, "Crocodile Dundee, mate." And he's like, "Yes." And he's like, "I may be alive because of Crocodile Dundee," which of course says an awful lot about nothing, but is interesting, right? About the cultural stereotypes and about how maybe a pop fictional character. But but on the one hand, you can play certain aspects of it, but on the other hand, it's really, a lot of times people will come and say, "Oh, it's just like in the movies," but it's also not like in the movies. And that's important because we get a very skewed, especially with American culture, which is so big. When I lived overseas, people say, "You miss America." I think it's hard to miss America when you live overseas because it's so there. But when I'm here, I miss Germany or I miss Britain or or the Netherlands because you don't get, right, Ich hou van Holland, which is a Dutch program, on American TV, right? But you constantly get American TV in Europe. So other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Excuse me. I want to know your assessment about the use of the mechanism of cultural diplomacy in South Asia and other parts of the world, because whatever I have been listening from you, I think it revolves around Germany building to New York.
Yeah. Where are you from?
And you hardly touch something about Russia.
Yeah.
But one of the greatest roles that the CIA and other organizations, the State Department and the Information Agency have been playing, it was in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other parts of the world, and we don't see as much as successful stories like that. So, as a career cultural diplomat, how do you see the role and implementation of the policy of cultural diplomacy in that particular area?
Where are you from in South Asia?
I'm from Pakistan.
From Pakistan. Whereabouts? Islamabad?
No, I'm from Karachi. I work for University of Karachi.
Oh, cool, great. So it's a great question. Well, I'm a big believer in that you should speak about what you know. And as a scholar, we always study and focus. So that's my area is Europe. But I think your point is well taken. And I'd say there's a couple reasons. One, the cultural diplomacy programs in South Asia, as well as I'm aware, probably haven't functioned as well because U.S. policy in South Asia has perhaps been at odds with much of the public sentiment as well as government policies there. So just because you send a bunch of students on an exchange program doesn't suddenly mean a society X will love you if the U.S. government is pursuing policies that alienate that public, right? You can't make up for that public. I think you can certainly ameliorate it. And this takes me to point two, which is sort of the level of engagement and understanding with the region, right? It's fair to say that the United States has had a relatively large amount of engagement from the US to Europe and vice versa. There is some to Russia. There's actually, the Russian government is running things called Alpha scholarships, right? Which tries to mimic the Bosch Foundation and it's sponsored by Alpha Bank, bringing students to Russia to work for a year and study Russian. And I think in South Asia, what would be beneficial would be, the thing is that the US, a lot of the world, when you think about US foreign policy, Latin America is a place where the U.S. has interfered, right? But it's not very prominent in a lot of American mindsets. Africa is a part of the world that's tremendously important, but often gets left aside in the discussions. And it seems to, and South Asia is a place where the U.S. has been involved. But again, every time you sit in big strategy meetings, this is off the record, but I'm lucky. People talk about Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and China, right? Those are the three big areas. Although the other parts of the world are phenomenally important, right? And so I think for those other parts of the world, in terms of engaging in the United States, there's a couple different aspects. One, what ability do those countries, does Pakistan have, and can you send more sort of cultural diplomats and youth to study in the United States, whether it's through US programs or your own? But two, activating the diaspora population, right? Diaspora populations are massive reserves, I think, of cultural diplomacy. One of the things I love about teaching at NYU is 60% of my students are overseas students. But the other 40% are ostensibly American. But one of my students, Ruhama, right, American, of Bangladeshi descent. She's first generation, right? So where is the line? And I have so many students like that, from Gaza, from India, from Bangladesh, from China, from Hong Kong, from Ghana, from South Africa, right? So they may be American, but they're very, very briefly removed. And a lot of the times, depending on the culture they're from, in the case of the student from Bangladesh, the family actually still has businesses and tea plantations and lots of engagement, right? And I've learned so much from her about Bangladesh, about the culture, about what it's like for her to be a woman in that culture, right? And it's been fascinating. And so activating a diaspora population is important. And if in the US, whether or not you like the policies, the best example of this are organizations that have mobilized the American Jewish population in support of Israel, right? The Indian American population is similarly working to organize itself. So this is, of course, with the intent of impacting American domestic politics and legislation, but they've studied AIPAC and other organizations that promote sort of Jewish American awareness of Israel to try and promote Indian American consciousness and policies within the United States and pressure, political pressure, right, towards US engagement with India. So I think you could look at whether it's India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, about how you send, what you can do to facilitate cultural diplomats from your side, whether official or unofficial through scholarships, but then also vice versa, working with the diaspora population. And we've actually had lots of, Zara Raymond is one of my favorite students, who's a Pakistani student. We've had a lot of, and that's where you get, right? It's just informal things, right? So Zara gets a bunch of students together, we all go out and have sort of food that she grew up with, right? And I take them to my house and, I'll cook pasta dinners or stuff that I grew up with. Despite my waspy name, I grew up in a very Italian-American household. So and I think that's the fundamentals. That has done a lot to help, I think, her classmates. And it was fascinating because she took my civil military class, and there was also a former military officer in that class, among others. And it was a German, so interesting perspective on civil military relations. And it was about, again, 60% overseas. It's the best discussions, right? And she learned a lot from the former military officer. She had very different views about how she thought he felt about things. And it turns out she was completely wrong. And sort of vice versa, right? About his view of having served and about US policy, and et cetera. And so that just to show you those fundamental aspects. But I do think that parts of the world like South Asia, like Africa and Latin America, get neglected partly on the US side. And so what's necessary is to get the push and the input from the other side, right?
If you don't mind,
yeah.
Let me comment kindly.
Please.
I am a USA alumnus in Pakistan.
Yeah.
I've been doing some projects for them also. Well, my understanding is that USAID and organizations like this, they have been more oriented towards the economic development, to build the solar energy projects, this and that. But the empowerment, giving the people a soft power, there has been less interest in their programs and agenda. But experience I want to share with you.
Yeah.
Very, very strange experience. In my faculty, present dean and the chairman of the history department, they use the scholarship of USAID for the postdoctorate. But when they came back to university, one of my Christian fellow who was a part of the course public policy, and just after attending that course, when he became as a chair of the political science department, what he was saying, these interfaith dialogues, these scholarships, these exchanges are foolish activities. these the Catholic Church and the Church in Pakistan and other groups, they hold interfaith conferences with the US consulate and all that. This all is rubbish. We cannot be friends with each other. But when that professor did not know that that particular student was belonged to Christian faith. But okay, after 1 week, another professor of the history, when he gave us same kind of views, it was astonishing for us, and I was thinking that where is the problem that even after spending so much money on exchanging and all that, the results to curb extremism and other kind of fanatic thoughts have not been achieved to the US government or maybe the other governments.
Yeah. Well, I think you raise a really good point, and I would say briefly, one, again, there's probably limitations on what cultural diplomacy can achieve in light of maybe, say, poor or just tough foreign policy choices. And second of all, I think part of it has to do with age and engagement, right? I do think the younger you get people, the more engaged and exposed they get to differences and to travel and to study overseas, the more open they will be. And at the end of the day, the programs can only open the door, right, to a broader world. If the person has their views and doesn't want to change their views, they won't change their views. But it doesn't mean the programs at large necessarily fail. But I take your point. I don't think it's something that's easy, and I do think when it comes to counter-radicalization, that there needs to be, and it's not my area of expertise, Colette knows much more about it, but I think we have to be careful about what we can expect, particularly from sort of short-term programs versus longer-term, right? I think when you're talking about interfaith dialogues and reconciliation and sort of coexistence among different groups that may have very hostile, a lot of enmity towards each other, it takes time, and that the goal needs to not be necessarily days or weeks or even years, but possibly a decade or two. But still, it's a goal worth pursuing if it brings about a much longer, I think, lasting peace and understanding. But it's certainly not an easy one. But again, and just in closing, there's a lot of cultural similarities. Religious differences can be difficult. I think because if you're impacted by the divine, you can make, you're thinking about the next life, not this one. But the United States had a very hostile relationship with Germany and Russia. I think there's still a lot of conflict between the governments. But there are tons of Russians in New York, right? And half of them are Americans, but also Russian. And the people get on really well. And that's why I think it's important on foreign policy sometimes to differentiate between the official policies and the government versus the people. And I think that when you look at where, particularly the German-American relationship, but also other adversarial relationships have migrated over time, change is possible. And I'll leave it at that.
Let's express our sincere gratitude to Professor Williams. Thank you very much. Thank you.